And hello, good evening, good morning, welcome, old people, young people, those wedged in between those two demographics who we will refer to either as the creamy filling or perhaps just as middle-aged folks. But anyway, it's good to see you and a pleasure to have you with me. I come to you on this early Sunday morning with plans to read, which I'm sure will astonish many of you who were assuming I would do something more useful or entertaining, but sadly, no. Anyway, so before I start saying hello to everybody, which I will in just a moment, let me see what else is going on. Well, everybody in our household has now had their second vaccine, pandemic news. And we are all, except for two of us, are I think now in the safety zone and have actually been through their couple of weeks or whatever they're supposed to do. And but the rest of us are in our stretch where we're waiting to get past the I don't know what we call it, the point of no return. No, that's not it. Anyway, so that's what's going on here, and then just working. And we were able to actually go out the other evening and go see some friends who are vaccinated, and it was a huge pleasure and excitement to get out of the house. That's the first thing I can say. I'd forgotten that there was a world out there still, and people in it who are not on screens. So that was a real pleasure. Anyway, so before we get to tonight's reading, and sorry for the slight delay starting the various new strictures that Facebook has added to having more than one account have made it even slower for me to post the URLs before I start. So I'll have to see if there's some other way I can come up with that. But I can't get the URL until I actually begin the live broadcast. So there's some way to think this through and to get around it. I can't think of it at the moment. Anyway, so let me check in and say hello to everybody. And first off the bat is Ilva. Hello, Ilva. How are you, sweetie? Good to see you. Cliff. Hi, Cliff. And Holger. Hello, hello. Wouter, Ronnie, Iris, or Iris. I'm not quite sure. I'm guessing Iris. Chris from Lübeck, from sunny, raining Lübeck. Carol, hello, good to see you too. Chris, guten Morgen. Jeremy, yes, plotting in my basement hideout. I'm always plotting. When I'm in my basement hideout, I am in fact plotting, which is kind of how you have to do it. What's the point of having a basement hideout if you can't plot in it? I mean, come on, really. Rosalba, hello, good to see you. Hazel, and there is my dear mother-in-law. Good morning, sweetie. Nice to see you virtually. Hope you're all well there. I hope you heard that news. We are all now vaccinated, double vaccinated, all the stuff we have to do, and we're just waiting it out here. But other than that, we're doing well. Holger, yes, I already said. You feel like you're in a clique. You are in a clique. It may not be a large clique, but that's the whole point, see? Large cliques are non-exclusive cliques. This is a just the right size clique of people with taste and perspicacity and insomnia. Anyway, Sherry, good to see you. And who else have we got here? Kim. Hello, Kim. Good morning to you. And what else? Who else have we got? Chris. Yes, thank you. I'm very pleased about the vaccination. And everybody else just seems to be talking to each other. Oh, dear. There's one. Hello, Dirk. Good to see you. And look at this. Hi, Jessica. This is everybody else just talking to each other. Hello, Suzanne, which is fine. I'm all in favor of it. Just as I'm going through to see who's signed in, though, it's always complicated. Anyway, so that's basically what's going on here, and I'm working as per usual. I really lead the most boring life. It's absolutely true. I work. Then when I'm not working, but I'm always sort of working because I'm always thinking about things. And that's really it. That's why it was so amazing to actually go out and see some friends last night. I kind of didn't know what to do half the time. I was like, are we in trouble? Is someone going to come and arrest us? It was very confusing for me because I don't get out much at the best of times. even when there's not a worldwide pandemic. And needless to say, since the worldwide pandemic, I have been even more, um, what's the opposite of footloose and fancy free? Bogged down and hidebound. I don't know, whatever it is. But that would be a good name for a comedy show, wouldn't it? A sitcom. Bogged down and hidebound. Anyway, so anything else I wanted to tell you guys about? Nah, just the usual. Just the usual. We're doing stuff. We're shuttling animals back and forth to the vet for checkups and things like that, and we're just doing stuff. We're still hanging out at home doing stuff. I'm working on Navigator's Children, of course, part one. Oh God, I'm so irritated with myself. And I'm putting together a proposal for another novel, which actually I'm finishing it up. I've already done most of the work on it. And that's about it. Just, that's it. I wish I had more to say. I wish I could be exciting and come up with like wonderful tidbits, or that I was, hanging out with famous people and running around and could say, yeah, just the other day, Tom Hanks and his wife had me over, and we had a grand time eating tiny little weenies on toothpicks. Oh, it was wonderful. But to this point, Tom Hanks and his wife, who I believe is still named Rita Wilson, they have not invited me over. And in fact, nobody has offered me little weenies on toothpicks. So what can I say? I'm feeling a little sorry for myself on the tiny weenies side of things. Don't quote me, please. Okay, so we're back to Shadowmarch. I'm not going to try and synopsize because we're full bore. I mean, look how far we are into the book already. We are full bore into the plot. We're going back to go see Quiniton again. Quiniton is the young, very young woman down in Zand, the southern continent, and specifically in the city of Zis. She is a temple acolyte of the fire god. And she has just been informed she is to be the bride of the autarch, who of course is the sort of pharaoh slash priest king slash emperor slash whatever you want to call it. So that's what we're reading about to begin with. And then we'll get back, I'm sure, to the Eden family and to Chert and Opal Blue Quartz and their newly adopted ward, Flint, and all that other stuff. But we're going to start off, well, you'll hear. Chapter 11. Bride of the God. The berries, white as bones, red as blood, red as coals, white as clay. Are none of them sweet? From the Bonefall Oracles. If Quiniton had thought that the autarch's throne room would be a more intimate setting than the cavernous temple of the hive, she would have been very wrong. The majesty of the Golden One's entourage was even more overwhelming here. The white and black tiled hall packed with hundreds of soldiers and servants and the representatives of dozens of noble families and of trade and bureaucratic interests, all joined together under the eyes of the watchful, wide-eyed gods painted on the ceiling. The autarch himself sat at the center of it all on the great falcon throne, an immense bird's head covered in topaz feathers, the eyes red jasper. Sulepus Bishak Amzis III himself was seated beneath the awning made by the upper part of the giant raptor's gaping golden beak. The autarch was surrounded by his legendary musketeers, the leopards, and the leopards were surrounded in turn by an almost equally famous troop of Pericles mercenaries, the White Hounds. These hounds were all second or third generation now, their forefathers originally captured by the current autarch's grandfather in a famous sea battle. Few of them could still speak the language of Pericles, but the master of much of the continent of Zand had more than enough pale-skinned women at his disposal to keep the present generation of hounds as white as their forebears. They were strange-looking men, these northerners, even to Quiniton's frightened, confused gaze, built more like the bears she had seen in pictures than like hounds, hairy and wide-bearded, broad of back and shoulder. From behind the Pericles mercenaries, one of the leopard soldiers was staring at her. An important soldier, judging by the long black tail on his helmet. He had a frown like a gash, and his elaborate armor only emphasized his own broad shoulders. Terrified she had already done something wrong, Quiniton dropped her eyes. When she looked up again, the knot of courtiers was moving away from the falcon throne, shuffling backward with many bows and flutterings of hands, and she could see the autarch once more. The young god on earth leaned back and gazed up at the stretching beak above his head, as if the room was empty but for himself, and briefly scratched his long nose. His gold finger stalls glittered, tiny guardians of the safety of all creation. It was a truth as powerful as the blueness of the sky that the autarch must not accidentally touch something impure. Quiniton's mother was weeping again. Quiniton was frightened too, but she still couldn't understand such behavior. She bumped her mother's side with an elbow, a piece of impertinence that would have been unthinkable in most families. "Hush," she whispered, which would have been thought even more inexplicable. We are so lucky," her mother said, sniffling. We? Even through the terror at being singled out, the overwhelming strangeness of it all, and even an unavoidable tingle of pride at having somehow caught the eye of the most powerful man in the world, Quiniton knew one thing. She didn't want to marry the autarch. There was something about him that frightened her very much, and it was not simply his matchless power or the things she had heard about his cruel whims. There was something in his eyes, something she had never seen in another person, but might have seen once in the eyes of a horse that had bounced its rider off his saddle, and then, when the man's foot caught in the stirrup, dragged him to his death through the crowded marketplace, smashing the rider's head against the cobbles for 100 paces before a soldier brought the beast down with an arrow. As the horse lay gasping out its last bubbling red breaths, she had seen its eye rolling in the socket, the eye of something that was not seeing what was really there. The autarch, although calm and apparently amused by what he observed around him, had such an eye. She did not want to be given to such a man, to go to his bed, to undress for him, and be touched and entered by him, even if he truly was a god upon the earth. The very idea made her shudder as if she had a fever. Not that she had any other choice. To refuse would be to die, and to see her father and mother and sisters and brothers die before her, and none of the deaths, she felt sure, would be swift. "Where are the bee girl's parents?" the autarch asked suddenly. The room fell silent at his voice. Someone let out a little nervous cough. "They stand here, Golden One," said an older man, wearing what looked like ceremonial armor made out of silver cloth, as he pointed a finger toward the place where Quiniton's mother and father huddled, face down on the stone floor. Quiniton suddenly realized she had not abased herself and put her head down. She imagined the man in silver cloth must be Pt.9, the paramount minister. "Bring them up," commanded the autarch in his strong, high voice. Someone coughed again. It sounded loud in the silence that followed the autarch's words, and she was terribly glad it wasn't either of her parents. "Do you give her up to be the bride of the god?" the minister asked her mother and father, who still cowered, unable to look up at the autarch. Even through her own misery, Quiniton was ashamed of her father. Chejret was a priest, able to stand before the altar of Nushash himself, so why should he be unable to face the autarch? Of course," her father said. We are honored. So we are." "Yes, you are." The autarch flicked his glittering finger at a wooden casket. "Give the money to them. Jedin, send some of your men to help them carry it home." The leopard soldier who had been staring at her earlier murmured a few words, and two of the autarch's riflemen stepped forward and lifted the chest. It was clearly heavy. 10 horses worth of silver, the autarch said. Generous payment for the honor of bringing your daughter into my house, is it not? The men with the money chest had already started back across the throne room. Quiniton's parents scrambled awkwardly after it, trying to keep it in sight, but not daring to turn their backs even slightly on the autarch. You are too kind, master of the great tent, her father called, bowing and bowing. You bring too much honor on our house. Quiniton's mother was crying again. A moment later, they were gone. Now, said the autarch. Then somebody coughed again. The autarch's lean face writhed in annoyance. Who is that? Bring him up here. 3 more leopards sprang down from the dais and out into the room, their polished, decorated guns held high. The crowd shrank back from them. A moment later they returned. They returned to the dais, dragging a frail young man. The crowd drew even farther back, as though he might be carrying a fatal illness, which, in fact, he probably was, since he had drawn the angry attention of the god on earth. Do you hate me so much that you must interrupt me with your braying? The autarch demanded. The young man, who had fallen onto his knees when the leopard soldiers let go of him, could only shake his head, weeping with terror. He was so frightened his face had turned the color of saffron. Who are you? The youth was clearly too frightened to answer. At last the paramount minister cleared his throat. He is an accounting scribe from my ministry of the treasury. He is good with sums. So are 1,000 merchants in Birdsnare Market. Can you tell me any reason I should not have him killed, Vash? He has wasted too much of my time already. Of course he has, Golden One, said the paramount minister with a gesture of infinite regret. All I can offer in his favor is that I am told he is a hard worker and very well liked among the other scribes. Is that so? The autarch stared up at the famous tiled ceiling for a moment, scratched his long nose with a long finger. He already seemed bored with the subject. Very well. Here is my sentence. Leopards, take him away. Beat him and break his bones with the iron bar. Then, if he is to survive, these so-called friends of his in the treasury may take care of him, feed him, so on. We shall see how far their friendship truly extends. The large crowd murmured approvingly at the wisdom of the autarch's sentence, even as Quiniton suppressed a shriek of horrified fury. The young man was taken away, his feet dragging on the floor, leaving a wet track like a snail. He had fainted, but not before emptying his bladder. A trio of servitors scurried to wipe the flagstones clean again. As for you, girl, the autarch said, still angry, and Quiniton's heart suddenly began to beat even more swiftly. Had he tired of her already? Was he going to have her killed? He had just bought her like a market chicken from her parents, and no one would raise a finger to save her. Stand before me. Somehow she made her legs work, just well enough to carry her up the steps and onto the dais. She was grateful to reach the spot before the falcon throne, grateful to be able to slump down onto her knees and not have to feel them quivering. She put her forehead against the cool stone and wished that time would stop, that she would never have to leave this spot and find out what else was in store for her. A powerful, sweet scent filled her nostrils, threatening to make her sneeze. She peered from half-opened lids. A group of priests had surrounded her like ants on a crumb of cake, blowing incense on her out of bronze bowls, perfuming her for the presence of the autarch. You are very lucky, little daughter. said Penimon Vash. You are favored above almost all women on the earth. Do you know that? Yes, Lord. Of course, Lord. She pushed her forehead harder against the stone, felt the area of cold spread on her skin. Her parents had sold her to the autarch without even a question as to what might become of her. She wondered if she could hit her head against the tiles hard enough to kill herself before someone stopped her. She didn't want to marry the Lord of the World. Just looking at his long face and strange bird-like eyes made her heart feel as though it would stop beating. This close, she almost thought she could sense the heat of his body coming off him, as though he were a metal statue that had sat all day in the sun. The idea of those thin-fingered hands touching her, the gold stalls scraping her skin as that face came down onto her own. Stand up! It was the autarch himself. She got to her feet, so wobbly that the paramount minister had to put his dry old hand under her elbow. The living god's pale, pale eyes moved over her body, up to her face, back down over her body. There was no lechery in it, nothing really human. It felt as though she hung on a butcher's hook. She's thin, but not ugly, said the autarch. She must go to the seclusion, of course. Give her to old Kuzi, and tell her that this one must have special and very careful treatment. Panhisser will tell her what is expected. To her astonishment, Quiniton found herself raising her eyes to meet the autarch's, heard herself say, Lord, Master, I don't know why you've chosen me, but I will do my best to serve you. You will serve me well, he said with an odd childlike laugh. May I ask one favor, great master? You will address the autarch Sulepis as living god on earth or as golden one, the paramount minister said sternly, even as the assembled throng murmured at her forwardness. Golden one, may I ask a favor? You may ask. May I say goodbye to my sisters in the hive, my friends? They were very kind to me. He looked at her for a moment, then nodded. Jedin, send some of your leopards to take her back for her farewells, and to bring with her anything she needs from her old life. Then she will enter the seclusion. His pallid eyes narrowed a little. You do not seem happy with the honor I have given you, girl. I am overwhelmed, Golden One. Fear had gripped her now. She could barely make her voice loud enough for him to hear a few paces away. She knew that to the rest of those assembled in the vast room, she would be unheard, not even a murmur. Please believe that I do not have the words to describe my happiness. The contingent of leopards marched her through the long passages of the orchard palace, a labyrinth that she had only heard about, but which, it seemed, would now be her home for the rest of her life. Thoughts swirled in her head like choking incense. Why does he want me? He had scarcely even looked at me before today. Not ugly, he said. That is what one says about an arranged marriage, but I bring nothing. My parents, nobody's. Why on earth should he choose me, even as one new wife among hundreds? The leopard band's captain, the muscular, serious-faced soldier called Jedin, was watching her again. He seemed as if he had been doing it for more than a moment, but she had only just noticed. Mistress, I apologize, he said, but I cannot give you long for your farewells. We are expected at the seclusion in a short time. She nodded. He had fierce eyes, but his glint seemed decidedly more human than the animating force behind the autarch's bottomless stare. When they came to the hive, all the girls somehow seemed to know Quiniton was coming. Perhaps the oracle predicted it, she thought, sour and miserable. She was about to pass beyond the reach of even the golden bees, and the thought frightened her. From the feminine deeps of the hive to the female prison of the seclusion, it did not seem like a good trade, however astonishing the honor of being chosen. High Priestess Rugen bade her farewell with pride but little sentiment. "You have brought great honor to us," she said, and kissed Quiniton on each cheek before returning to her chambers and her accounts. Chief Acolyte Crissa, on the other hand, seemed genuinely sorry to see her go, although there was a powerful pride in her face as well. "No one has ever gone from the hive into the seclusion," she said, eyes glowing with the same light of religiosity that filled her when the bees spoke. Quiniton could believe that Crissa might be dreaming of how wonderful it would have been if she, instead of Quiniton, had been chosen. Quiniton was doing the same. "Do you really have to go?" Dooney was crying, but she seemed almost as excited and pleased as Crissa. "Why can't you live here until it happens?" "Don't be foolish, Dunyaza," the chief acolyte told her. "Someone who is to be the autarch's wife cannot live in the hive. What if she... Crissa frowned. "It just would not be right. He is the living god on earth." When the chief acolyte had gone, Quiniton had begun putting her few personal articles into a bag. The carved bone comb her mother had given her when she had first been called to the sacred bees, a necklace of polished stones from her brothers, a tiny metal mirror from her sisters, the festival dress she had never worn since becoming a hive sister. As she packed these things up, trying to answer Dooney's excited questions as best she could, after all, how much could she tell when she had no idea what was to happen to her, why she had been chosen, or how she had been noticed? She realized that from now on she was not going to be a person anymore, at least not for her hive sisters, but a story. "I'm going to be Quiniton, the girl the autarch noticed and plucked out of their midst. They're going to talk about me at night. They'll wonder if it ever might happen again to one of them. They're going to think it's a wonderful romantic tale like Dasmet and the girl with no shadow. Don't forget about me," she said suddenly. Dooney stared at her in amazement. "Forget about you? Quenya, how could we ever? No, I mean don't forget about the real Quiniton. Don't make up silly stories about me." She stared at her friend, who for once was shocked into silence. "I'm scared, Dooney." "Getting married isn't so bad," her friend said. "My older sister told me..." She broke off, eyes wide. "I wonder if gods do it the same way people do." Quiniton shook her head. Dooney would never understand. "Do you think you could come visit me?" "What, you mean in the seclusion?" "Of course, it's only men who aren't allowed in. Please say you will." "Quinn, Yes, I'll come as soon as the sisters will let me." She threw her arms around Dooney. Mistress Crissa was standing in the doorway of the Acolytes' Hall, letting her know that the soldiers were growing impatient outside the temple. "Don't forget about me," Quiniton whispered in her friend's ear. "Don't make me into some princess." Dooney could only shake her head in confusion, as Quiniton took the sack with her pitiful array of possessions and followed the chief acolyte. "One more thing," Crissa said. "Mother Mudry wishes a word with you before you go." "The oracle? With me?" Mudry could hardly know Quiniton at all. They had never been any nearer to each other than a dozen paces since Quiniton had come to the hive. Did even that august old woman desire to curry a little favor with the autarch? Quiniton supposed she must. But the nicest thing he said about me was that I wasn't ugly. Doesn't give me much power to get favors done, now does it? They walked through the darkest part of the hive. The sleepy murmuring of the bees washed in through the air shafts high in the walls. There was nowhere in the hive that their song could not be heard. If the bees noticed the departure of one of the younger acolytes, it didn't seem to bother them. The oracle's room smelled of lavender water and sandalwood incense. Oracle Mudri sat in her high-backed chair, her face lifted expectantly toward the door, blind eyes moving behind the lids. She reached out her hands. Quiniton hesitated. They looked like claws. "Is that the child? The girl?" Quiniton looked around, but Crissa had left her at the doorway to the inner chamber. "It's me, Mother Mudri," she said. "Take my hands. It's very kind." "Hush!" She said it harshly, but without anger, a warning to a child not to touch a naked flame. Her cold hands closed on Quiniton's fingers. "We have never sent one to the seclusion before, but Rugen tells me she thought you unusual." She shook her head. "Did you know that it was all ours once, girl? Surigali was the mistress of the hive, and Nushash her cowering consort." Quiniton had no idea what this meant, and it had been a long and confusing day. She stood silent as Mudri squeezed her fingers. The old woman paused, as if listening, face lifted to the ceiling, much as earlier that day the autarch had stared at nothing while deciding to have a man's bones shattered because he had coughed. The old woman's hand seemed to grow warmer, almost hot, and Quiniton had to force herself not to pull away. The oracle's lined face seemed to grow slack. Then the toothless mouth fell open in a gape of dismay. "It is as I feared," Mother Mudri said, letting go of Quiniton's hands. "It is bad, very bad." "What? What do you mean? Did the oracle have some knowledge of her fate? Was she to be slain by her husband-to-be as so many others had been slain?" "A bird will fly before the storm." Mudri spoke so quietly Quiniton could barely hear her. "Yet it is hurt and can scarcely keep wing. Still, that is all the hope that remains when the sleeper awakens. Still, the old blood is strong. Not much hope at all." She swayed for a moment, then stopped, her face turned straight toward Quiniton's. If she had been sighted, she might have stared. "I am tired. Forgive me. There is little we can do, and it is of no use to frighten you. You must remember who you are, girl, that is all." Quiniton had no idea if this was how the old woman usually behaved, but she knew the oracle was indeed frightening her, whether she wanted to or not. "What do you mean, remember? That I'm a hive sister?" "Remember who you are, and when the cage is opened, you must fly. It will not be opened twice." "But I don't understand." Crissa put her head in the door. "Is everything all right? Mother Mudri?" The old woman nodded. She gave Quiniton's hand one last leathery squeeze, then let go. "Remember, remember." It was all Quiniton could do, not to cry, as the chief acolyte handed her back over to the soldiers and their captain, silently glowering Jedin, so they could conduct the new bride-to-be away to the hidden fastness of the seclusion. Chapter 12. Sleeping in Stone. On the long afternoon. "What are these that have fallen?" They sparkle beside the trail like jewels, like tears. Are they stars? From the Bonefall Oracles. Chert watched Micah and Talc dressing the stone on the wall above the tomb. The Schists could be clannish, and since they were Hornblend's nephews, he had thought they might give trouble to their uncle's replacement. But instead they had been nothing but helpful. In fact, his whole crew had been exemplary. Even Pumice was doing his work with a minimum of complaining. Whatever they might not have liked about the original job, they had swallowed it for the sake of getting the Prince Regent's tomb ready. And a good thing, too. The only light where Chert stood were the torches in the stone wall sconces. 4 of the sconces new carved. But he felt certain the morning sun must already be creeping above the eastern battlements, which meant only a few hours remained until the funeral. It had not been easy, any of it, and Chert could only thank his blue quartz ancestors that it had been a comparatively small task, the construction of one new room, and that they were working mostly with limestone. Even so, in some cases they had been forced to cut corners, or not cut corners, to be more accurate. The new chamber was oddly shaped and still unfinished on the far end, where a low tunnel opened into farther caverns, and they had dressed only the wall into which the Prince Regent's tomb had been cut. Lumps of hard flint still floated like islands in all the finished walls, and most of the carvings would have to be completed later as well. There had barely been time for little Carbon to decorate the tomb itself and the wall just around it, but the craftsman had done a fine job despite the haste, turning a raw hole in the bones of the mount into a sort of forest bower. The stone plinth on which the Prince Regent's coffin would lie seemed a bed of long, living grasses. The tree trunks and hanging leafy branches carved into the walls of the crypt had been crafted with such delicacy that they seemed to fall away into the distance, row upon row. Chert almost felt he could walk into the carving toward the heart of a living forest. "It is splendid," he told little Carbon, who was doing a last bit of fine work on a group of flowers in the plinth. "No one will be able to say that the Funderlings have not done their part, and more." Little Carbon wiped dust from his sweaty face. He looked older than his true age. He was only a few years married, but already had the wizened features of a grandfather, and white in his beard that did not come from limestone dust. "Sad job, though. You'd have thought this was to be my son's to do, or even my grandson's, not mine. He went too young, the poor prince. And who'd have believed that southerner fellow would have done it? After all these years, he seemed almost civilized." Chert turned and called to the others to hurry with pulling down the scaffolding. Micah and Talc were on the ground now and nearly done, but the work gang still had to plaster the holes where the scaffold beams had been driven into the walls, and it needed to be done soon. Ninor, the Castellan, had a dozen men and women waiting to fill the Eden family crypt with flowers and candles. Little Carbon squinted at a stone bloom, gave it a couple of last pokes with his chisel, then began working it with a polishing stick. Speaking of sons, where's that one of yours?" Chert felt an odd mixture of pride and irritation to hear the boy referred to as his son. "Flint? I sent him out before you got here. He'll be playing up ground. All his messing about was going to send me mad." Which was only part of the truth. The child had been acting so strangely that it frightened him a little. In fact, Flint had been acting up so much that for a few moments Chert had feared it might be bad air leaking in through the cavern end of the tomb. Breath of the Black Deep, his people called it, and it had killed many a Funderling over the years. But none of the others had been affected. It had quickly become clear that the boy's behavior was odder than even a pocket of bad air could explain. He seemed both drawn to and afraid of the dark opening at the end of the tomb, grunting to himself as he peered into it like a much younger child, or even like an animal. Chert had thought fearfully and singing. Let me start that sentence over again. He seemed both drawn to and afraid of the dark opening at the end of the tomb, grunting to himself as he peered into it like a much younger child, or even like an animal, Chert had thought fearfully, and singing snatches of unrecognizable songs. But when he had pulled the boy away, Flint had answered questions with no less reticence than usual, saying that the sound of the cavern beyond frightened him, whatever that meant, that he could hear voices and smell things. Things I don't understand, was all he would or could offer by way of explanation, that I don't want to understand. But when Chert had grabbed a chunk of glowing coral and got down on his knees to poke his head into the raw, unworked limestone cavern beyond, he had found nothing unusual. With a pressing job and the memory of what Cinnabar had said about the men's restiveness fresh in his thoughts, Chert had made his mind up quickly. He didn't want the boy kicking up a fuss and putting the men off their work, so he had taken Flint up the stairs and told him to stay inside the boundaries of the cemetery, but under no circumstances to go out of sight of the top steps of the tomb. With Chert's men carrying limestone chips out of the mound in wheeled barrows all day, he had thought the boy could not get into too much trouble without being noticed. Thinking about it now, as little Carbon used a wet rag dipped in fine sand to scrape away a last few imperfections, Chert realized that he hadn't heard or seen anything of the boy in some time, although he would have expected him to have come back down by now looking for his mid-morning meal. He called the last few suggestions to the men, tugging apart the scaffolding, patted little Carbon on the shoulder, then stumped off to see what the child was up to. A few of Ninor's big folk were working in the outer chambers of the tomb, cleaning and preparing it for the burial procession, scrubbing soot off the walls where torches had burned, strewing rushes and never-fade blossoms on the floor. All these growing things filled the rock halls with a smell that reminded Chert of the days when he was courting Opal and took her up ground to walk along the sea meadows at Land's End. She had later told him that for a girl who had almost never been out of Funderling Town, it had both been exciting and frightening to stand looking down at the sea and that immensity of open sky. He remembered feeling an expansive pride, as though he had made it all for her. But the scent of flowers and a few happy memories of his younger days could not change the nature of the place. In niche after niche lay the mortal remains of the Edens who had ruled Southmarch, of lives that might once have been grand or insignificant, but were all the same now. Still, when they were alive, someone cared for them, he thought. Their bodies were brought to this place by weeping mourners, just as others would bring the murdered prince this day. Then they had been left to sleep in stone until the machineries of time wore them away to dry dust and knobs of bone. It did not make Chert fearful, although the Funderlings themselves did not bury their dead, but neither could he ignore the presence of so many finished lives. Some of the grander caskets, made in stone or metal to outlast the ages, had an effigy not of the occupant as he or she looked in life, although there were many of those, but of the occupant in death, withering and decaying, a style of funerary art from 3 centuries earlier. During those years after the plague, it seemed that many of the dying wished to remind the living just how transitory their good luck would be. Why all the mystery? Chert wondered. These bodies of ours come out of the earth, come out of all we eat and drink and breathe, and they go back to earth in the end, whatever the gods may do with the spark that is inside us. But he could not be as blithe as he wished, and even though there were big folk busily at work in the catacombs around him, still he hurried. Lately, even before the Prince Regent's death, all around him had begun to seem tinged with the chill breath of mortality, a hint of the endings of things. For once a child of stone was glad to see the raw daylight, but the lift in his spirits did not last long. Flint was nowhere to be seen, and although Chert walked through all the graveyard and even into the gardens beyond, calling and calling, he could not find him. Bryony stood, naked and cold from the bath, looking down at her own pale limbs and hating the weakness of her womanhood. If I were a man, she thought, then Summerfield and Lord Brone and the others would not seize at my every word. They would not think me weak. Even if I had a withered arm like Berwick's, they would fear my anger. But because of the accident of my birth, of my sex, I am suspect. The room was chill, and she was trembling. Oh, Father, how could you leave us? She closed her eyes, and for a moment she became a child again, shivering while the nurses bustled around her, drying her small body with flannels, the great house full of familiar sounds. Where does time go when it is used up? She wondered. Is it like the sound of voices that echo and echo in a long hallway, growing smaller and smaller until they're too faint to hear? Is there an echo somewhere of that time when we were all together? Kendrick alive? Father here? Berwick well? But even if there were, it would only be a dying echo, populated by ghosts. She raised her arms. Dress me, she told Moina, and rose. The thought of her father, the sudden urge to see him, or at least to hear his voice, had reminded her of something. Where was his letter? The one Dowett, Dan Farr, had brought from Hyrosol. Perhaps it was with some of Kendrick's other effects. She had not had a chance to look through them all yet. But her father's letter was not like other papers. She not only needed to see it, she wanted to, desperately. She would look for it after the funeral. Kendrick's funeral. The horror of what lay ahead made her knees weak, but she straightened, held herself firm. She would not show her ladies how fearful she was, how helpless and hopeless. Rose and Moina were strangely quiet. Bryony wondered if they were as overwhelmed as she was, or merely respecting her mood and the dread weight of the day. And what did it matter? Death made its own respect, one way or another. They slipped on her chemise, working a little to pull it into place over her damp skin. The petticoat tied at the back with points. She was still barefoot, and it pooled around her feet. Rose pulled the laces too tight as she tied the corset, and Bryony grunted, but did not ask her to loosen it. She had learned that these formal clothes served a purpose. Like a soldier's armor, they gave an outward semblance of strength, even when the body inside was weak. But I don't want to be weak. I want to be strong, like a man, for the family and for our people. But what did that mean? There were many kinds of strength. The bear-like power of someone like Avon Brone, or the more subtle force Kendrick had possessed. Her older brother had once thrown one of the bigger guards so hard in a wrestling match that the man had to be carried away. Thinking of Kendrick made her breath hitch. He was so alive. He can't be gone. How can a single night change the world? But there were other kinds of strength, too, she thought, as Moina and Rose helped her into the black silk dress, stiff with black brocade and delicate silver and gold filigree. Father almost never raises his voice, and I've never seen him strike a blow in anger, but only fools ever called him weak. And why are only men thought strong? Who has held this family together in the past days? Not me, may Zoria forgive me. It had not been Berwick either, or even the Lord Constable. No, it had been Bryony's great-aunt, Marilana, stern and set as the mount itself, who had ordered life and made a little sense of death. Rose and Moina were busy as bees around a dark flower, unbending and spreading the ruffled cuffs of Bryony's dress, trimming a loose thread from the hem, and then slipping on her shoes, one of them bracing her so she could lift her foot, while the other guided the black slipper into place. For a moment she was filled with love for these girls. They too were being brave, she decided. Men's wars happened far away, and they proved their courage in front of armies of other men. Women's wars were more subtle things, and were witnessed mostly by others of their sex. Her ladies-in-waiting and all the other women in the castle were waging a battle against chaos, struggling to lend sense to a world that seemed to have lost it. She did not like what the world had forced upon her, but today, Bryony decided, she was still proud to be what she was. When they had finished with her shoes, the ladies-in-waiting draped her in a cloak of heavy black velvet that her father had given her, but which she had never worn. She sat on a high stool, or rather leaned, half standing, so that Rose could bring out her jewelry, and Moina and one of the younger maids could begin to arrange her hair. "Don't bother with all that," she told Moina, but gently. Her lady-in-waiting stopped, the curling iron already in her hands. "I will wear a headdress, the one with silver stitching." With as much ceremony as a mantis producing a shrine's sacred object, Rose set the jewel casket on a cushion and opened the lid. She pulled out the largest necklace, a heavy chain of gold with pendant ruby, a gift from Bryony's father to the mother she had scarcely known. "Not that," Bryony said. "Not today. There, the heart, and nothing else." Rose lifted the slender silver necklace, confusion showing on her face. The leaping deer pendant was a small and insignificant piece, and seemed out of keeping with the heavy majesty of her other garments. "Kendrick gave it to me. A birthday gift." Rose's eyes filled as she draped it around her mistress's neck. Bryony tried to wipe the girl's tears away, but the sleeves of her gown were too stiff, her cloak too massive. Excuse me. "Curse it, don't you dare start that. You'll have me going too." "Cry if you want to, my lady," Moina said, sniffling. "We haven't begun your face yet." Bryony laughed a little despite herself. The wretched sleeves would not let her wipe her own eyes either, so she could only sit helplessly until Rose brought a kerchief to blot her dry again. Her hair pulled back and knotted at the back of her head, she sat as patiently as she could, while the two ladies-in-waiting began to daub things on her cheeks and eyelids. She hated face paint, but today was not an ordinary day. The people, her people, had already seen her cry. Today they had to see her strong and dry-eyed, her face a mask of composure. And it was a distraction for Rose and Moina as well, this unusual liberty. They were laughing again as they brushed rouge onto her cheeks, despite their still damp eyes. When they had finished, they lowered the gabled headdress onto her head and fastened it with pins, then spread its black velvet fall onto her shoulders and down her back. Bryony felt solid and unbending. "The guards will have to come and carry me. I swear I cannot move an inch. Bring me a glass." Moina blew her nose, while Rose hurried to find the looking-glass. The other maids formed into a respectful half-circle around her, whispering, impressed. Bryony regarded herself, all in black from head to foot, with only a glint of silver at her brow and breast. "I look like Seveda, the Moon Maiden, like the goddess of night." "You look splendid, Your Highness," said Rose, suddenly all formality. "I look like a ship under full sail, big as the world." Bryony sighed, and her breath caught. "Oh, gods, come and help me up. I have to bury my brother." A boy was clinging high on the wall on the outside of the chapel building. But even in this time of fear, when murderous enemies might still be at large, no one in Southmarch Castle seemed to have noticed him. At the moment he was crouching in the corner of a vast window frame, the colored glass surrounding him like the background of a painting. Although the chapel was full of people, if anyone inside had taken note of the shadow at the bottom of the great window, they had decided it was only grime or a drift of leaves. A group of servants hurried up the path from the graveyard toward the doorway that led to the inner keep, still carrying the baskets they had brought down an hour before, but with only a few petals now remaining in the bottoms. The rest had been scattered inside the tomb and along the winding path through the cemetery. The boy did not look down at them, and they were all far too intent on their just finished tasks and their whispered conversations to look up. Something above the boy's head caught his attention. A butterfly, a big one, all yellow and black, lit on the edge of the roof and sat there with its wings beating as slowly as a tranquil heart. It was late in the season for butterflies. He found the edge of the window with his stubby, dirty fingers and pulled himself up until he was standing beside one edge of the leaded glass window. Anyone watching from the inside would now have seen the drift of leaves suddenly become a vertical column. But no sound came to him from behind the glass except the continuing low hum of a chorus singing the Lay of Kernios, longest and most expansive of the funeral songs. A moment later the column was gone, and the window was unshadowed again. Flint pulled himself up onto one of the protruding carvings that decorated the outside wall of the chapel, then moved sideways like a spider to another, before climbing up to a higher one. Within a matter of moments, even as a gate on the far side of the graveyard closed behind the basket-carrying servants and their voices fell away, he was onto the roof. The chapel rooftop was a great angled field of slate, with spiral chimneys protruding every few yards like trees. Moss and even living tufts of long grass poked up between the slates, and the autumn wind had piled great drifts of leaves against the chimneys like red and brown snow. Many other rooftops were visible from this spot, plateaus almost touching each other in jostling profusion, but most of the towered inner keep still stretched far above his head on all sides, the forest of chimneys rendered in giant size. Flint seemed to care about none of those things. At first he only lay on his belly and stared at the place where the butterfly sat near the roof's summit, fanning its wings indolently. Then the boy began to crawl upward, digging his feet into the eruptions of moss and lifted slate, until he was within arm's reach of the creature. His hand stretched out, and the butterfly suddenly sensed him, tumbled over the edge, and was gone. But the boy did not stop. His fingers closed on something quite different, and he plucked it out of the grass and brought it close to his face. It was an arrow, small as a darning needle. He squinted. It was fletched with tiny crests of the same yellow and black as the butterfly's wings. For long moments the boy lay silently, motionlessly, staring at the arrow. Someone watching might have thought he had fallen asleep with his eyes open, so complete was his stillness, but the watcher would have been wrong. He abruptly rolled and scrambled across the rooftop to the nearest chimney, fast as a striking snake, and thrust with his hand, first at one spot, then another, grabbing after something that fled through the little forest of grass around the base of the bricks. His hand closed, and suddenly he was still again. He pulled back his fist, holding it close to his body, as he sat down with the chimney against his back. When he opened his hand, the thing huddling there did not move until he poked it gently with his finger. The little man, who now rolled over and crouched in Flint's palm, was not much taller than that finger. The man's skin seemed sooty dark, although it was hard to say how much of that was truly skin and how much was dirt. His eyes were wide, little pinpricks of white in the shadow of the boy's hand. He tried to leap free, but Flint curled his fingers into a cage, and the little man crouched again, defeated. He was clothed in rags and bits of gray pelt. He wore soft boots and had a coil of coarse thread looped over his shoulder, a quiver of arrows on his back. Flint bent and picked something out of the grass. It was a bow, strung so fine that the cord could barely be seen. Flint looked at it for a moment, then set it on his palm beside the little man. The captive looked from the bow toward his captor, then picked it up. He passed the bow slowly from hand to hand with a kind of wonder, as though it had become something totally different since he touched it last. Flint stared at him, unsmiling, brow furrowed. The little man gulped air. "Hurt me not, master, I beg ye," he fluted, something like hope in his eyes where before there had been only terror. "Thou hast me fair, skin to sky. Grant thy wish I will. All know a roof-topper will keep on's word." Flint frowned, then set the little man down on the slate. The prisoner got to his feet, hesitated, took a few steps, then stopped again. Flint didn't move. His little face screwed up in confusion. The tiny man at last turned away and began scrambling up the moss paths between the slates, heading for the roof crest with his bow dangling in his hand. Every few steps he looked back over his shoulder, as though expecting his apparent freedom to prove only a cruel game. But by the time he reached the top, the boy still had not moved. "Oh, thou'rt good, young master," the tiny man cried, his voice almost inaudible from a yard and a half away. "Bide down, and uns after-comers will remember thee. That be promised." He vanished over the roof crest. Flint sat against the chimney until the sun was high above him, until the dim moan of the chorus below had ended, then began his climb back down. And that's where we're going to stop. Mid-chapter, but at a stopping point. Anyway, so since we've gone a little past the top of the hour, I will not spend a lot of time chatting here at the end, but I will say, of course, that I will be reading more later today, 7 p.m. my time, as it is now 3 a.m. my time. I hope those of you who can will come and join me. And in the interim, whether you show up then or next week at this same time when we do this particular reading again, I hope you will all continue to take good care of yourselves. Get vaccinated if you're not vaccinated yet. Take care of your friends and loved ones, family and neighbors and everybody else, as we all need to take care of ourselves and each other. And I will see you very soon. And I bid you good night and good morning from the Beale Williams Honor Rancho, and hope to see you again very soon.